Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer saw when he looked at her. That's all anyone at Cedar Creek Medical saw when Katie Rodriguez moved through the graveyard shift like smoke through a corridor, present but invisible, efficient but unremarkable. He didn't know that her hands had held 17 lives together in the dark. He didn't know that the folded flag in her locker belonged to someone who didn't come home. He had no idea what was walking through his hospital in navy blue scrubs and a pulled-back ponytail. The night shift at Cedar Creek Medical began at 11 o'clock, and by 11:15, Katie had already restocked 3 crash carts, verified medication counts, and caught a discrepancy in the supply orders that should have been impossible for one person to notice. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above the empty corridors of the ICU wing. 11:47 p.m. The world outside the hospital windows had gone the kind of dark that only comes to Colorado Springs in winter, the kind of dark that made the glass feel like a barrier between 2 different universes. Inside, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and something deeper, something like resignation, like the particular exhaustion that only comes from watching other people suffering for 8 hours at a time. Katie moved through the hallways with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, each step deliberate, each movement economical. There was no wasted motion in her body, no casual leaning against walls or checking her phone. Her scrubs were pressed with hospital corners, and her badge hung at a 45-degree angle from her chest. She was arranging supplies in Crash Cart 3 when the admission notification came through the overhead system. Not overhead. Overhead was for code blues. This was the quiet channel, the one that meant admissions, transfers, the orchestrated ballet of hospital logistics. Admiral James Harrison, post-operative day 1, triple-vessel coronary artery bypass grafting, stable vitals, transferred from the surgical recovery unit to the ICU for overnight monitoring. Age 64. No complications noted. Routine post-op care expected. Katie's hands paused for exactly 1 second on the defibrillator pads she was arranging. Not because the name meant anything to her. Not because she recognized the rank. She paused because she recognized the pattern, the high-ranking military officer, admitted to a facility 3 blocks from Colorado Springs' main military recruitment center, and no family listed as emergency contact. She filed the detail away without consciously deciding to do so. Observation was a habit that had kept her alive in Ramadi. Old habits didn't require permission to continue. The Admiral arrived at ICU Bay 7 at 12:03 a.m., moved with the careful choreography of post-surgical patients, one hand on the chest, one hand on the four-pole, each step a negotiation with pain medication and surgical trauma. The surgical team handed off to the ICU attending with the compressed language of physicians, excellent conduits, minimal bleeding, sinus rhythm throughout recovery, no VTAC events, EF estimated at 42% post-op. The Admiral's eyes were still glassy with anesthesia, his skin the particular shade of pale that comes from lying under bright lights for 5 hours while someone rebuilt the plumbing of your heart. He would sleep for another 4 hours. The monitors would beep their gentle rhythm. The 4 would drip its antibiotics and anticoagulants into his arm. Everything about his care would be textbook standard. Everything about his presence at Cedar Creek Medical would be invisible to everyone who didn't know how to look for patterns. Katie watched from the supply station as Dr. Mercer arrived for his evening rounds at 12:30. He moved differently through the corridors than the night nurses did. Where they flowed around obstacles, he seemed to displace them. His white coat was expensive, tailored, the kind of garment that announced itself as an accessory to authority rather than a practical piece of medical clothing. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a lanyard of rank. When he entered ICU Bay 7, Katie was already 3 bays down, restocking medication drawers with the kind of quiet that made it easy for people to forget she was there at all. She could hear his voice though, that particular tone he used during rounds, the one that was just loud enough to carry the implication that his words should be listened to, that his presence was the most important fact in any room he occupied. Excellent work in recovery, he said to the surgical resident who had managed the Admiral's post-op care. Monitor the hemodynamics closely. If we see any T-wave changes, I want to know immediately. He's too valuable for any complications. The resident, a woman who looked like she'd been awake for approximately 36 hours and was held together mostly by coffee and institutional obligation, nodded and wrote something in her tablet. Dr. Mercer made his own notes, the kind of notes that would later appear in charts, the kind that created a paper trail that protected physicians and occasionally incriminated them. Katie understood paper trails. She understood the difference between what happened and what could be proven to have happened. She understood the gap between observation and documentation, and she had spent the last 4 years being very, very careful about which side of that gap she stood on. The Admiral slept while monitors beat their steady electronic reassurance. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a man whose body was healing from trauma, whose heart was learning to pump blood through new vessels, whose survival had already been decided by surgeons with steady hands and insurance approvals that had been processed weeks in advance. Katie completed her medication count at 1:15 a.m. and moved to the supply inventory, the task that no one else wanted, the task that no one else would think to do with any kind of precision. Supply counts were busy work. Supply counts were something you marked off a checklist. Except Katie Rodriguez had learned in Ramadi that the difference between a successful operation and a catastrophic failure often came down to inventory, knowing exactly what you had, where it was, and whether you could access it under pressure. The spreadsheet on the supply station computer showed exactly what it was supposed to show: equipment ordered on December 4th, equipment received on December 6th, equipment logged into inventory on December 6th at 2:07 p.m. Except the defibrillator that had been logged at 2:07 p.m. was a different model than the one that had been ordered on December 4th. And it was logged as received, but the delivery log in the paper files, the ones that Dr. Mercer apparently didn't know how to read because he was too busy managing his authority, showed that model arriving on December 10th. 4 days later. 4 days of a defibrillator that was supposed to be in inventory but wasn't. 4 days of billing that had occurred for equipment that was somewhere else, in someone else's hands, being used for some other purpose. Katie pulled the paper file. She cross-referenced the invoice number. She checked the serial number on the actual defibrillator in Bay 3 against the one listed on the paperwork. They didn't match. Not even close. The invoice serial number corresponded to a unit that, according to the delivery log, had been shipped to a different hospital entirely, Mercy General in Denver, 45 minutes north, but had somehow been logged into Cedar Creek's inventory anyway. And then billed to Cedar Creek's insurance contracts at the full replacement cost of $8,997. The kind of discrepancy that no one would notice if they weren't obsessive enough to actually compare numbers, if they weren't the kind of person who understood that supply chains were just logistics, and logistics could be manipulated by anyone with access to both the paperwork and the willingness to assume that no one was actually reading it carefully. She didn't report it. Not yet. Not without understanding the full scope of what she was looking at. Katie had learned in Ramadi that moving too quickly on intelligence could blow back on you in ways that were difficult to recover from. She had learned that some patterns took time to fully reveal themselves, and that the person who identified the pattern was often also the person who became expendable once the pattern was understood. Instead, she made a photocopy of the relevant documents. Just the supply log, the invoice, the delivery records. Nothing that couldn't be explained as routine paperwork review. She folded them and placed them in her locker, under the folded flag that still carried the faint smell of dust from a place that didn't exist in any official record. The Admiral woke at 4:30 a.m., which was early but not unusual for post-operative patients. His eyes were clearer now, the anesthesia metabolized, the consciousness returning to a man who had been in command of something significant enough that his children were listed in his military file but his home address was listed as officer quarters. Katie was checking his for-catheter site when he opened his eyes, just a routine task, something she was supposed to do, something that gave her a clinical reason to be standing at the head of his bed. His eyes focused on her with the kind of clarity that comes from military training, the kind of gaze that doesn't miss details. She didn't look away. People who looked away made themselves memorable. People who looked away suggested they had something to hide. "Water?" she asked. 2 syllables. No inflection. The way a nurse talks to any post-operative patient. "Please," he said, and his voice was rough, which was normal, the consequence of the breathing tube they had used while his chest was open. She poured water from the pitcher into a cup, inserted a bendy straw, positioned the cup so he could reach it without straining the surgical site. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. Not fear. Pain. Medication. The particular weakness that comes from your body deciding that healing is going to require a lot of resources for the next several weeks. She removed the cup when he was done, replaced it on the table, adjusted his pillows because his shoulders were tense in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Monitor will alert for any changes, she said. This was the script. The reassurance. The promise that someone would be watching, someone would notice if something went wrong. She meant it in the way that all nurses mean it, a genuine commitment to the abstract concept of vigilance, even if the specific mechanics of that vigilance often came down to machines doing the actual watching while humans occasionally glanced at screens. Thank you, he said, and something in his eyes suggested he was looking at her, really looking, not just at a nurse but at a person. She held the gaze for 2 seconds, then moved to the next monitor check, the next set of vitals, the next routine task in the endless sequence of tasks that constituted a night shift in an ICU. By 5 a.m., Dr. Mercer had not reviewed the supply logs yet. By 6 a.m., the night shift was handing off to the day shift, and Katie was preparing to leave, to exit the hospital, walk to the bus stop, board the 6:16 a.m. Colorado Avenue line, and return to the small apartment where she had learned how to exist without being noticed. Behind her, the Admiral slept peacefully, his heart pumping blood through new vessels, his body healing from trauma, his file containing exactly 0 information about the Navy SEAL team he had commanded or the operations he had authorized or the lives that had been lost under his leadership and subsequently erased from every official record. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Katie Rodriguez was about to walk out of the hospital and into a situation that neither she nor Admiral Harrison had anticipated, a collision course that had been set in motion the moment his name had appeared on the admission log, the moment she had noticed the supply discrepancies that would eventually expose something far darker than a simple billing error. Morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical moved at a relentless pace, 7 patients in 2 hours, for lines and discharge paperwork and the constant hum of machines that never stopped breathing. Katie pushed the supply cart past room 304, where Mr. Chen sat propped against pillows, his wife beside him reviewing a hospital invoice with the confused expression of someone trying to decode a foreign language. She paused. The billing sheet listed a defibrillator charge, $800 for $800 for equipment deployment during the code from last night. Katie had been there for the entire arrest. She'd watched the monitors flatline. She'd handed the attending the AED pads. No defibrillator had been used. Not once. She knocked softly on the door frame. Mrs. Chen looked up, relief crossing her face at the sight of a familiar face. Nurse Rodriguez, can you help us understand these charges? Mr. Chen's hand trembled as he held the paper. Katie kept her voice level, professional, the way she'd learned to speak in briefings where precision meant lives. I was present during your code last night. The charges list a defibrillator deployment, but we only used the automated external defibrillator, the AED. That shouldn't generate a separate charge. She pointed to the line item, not accusatory, just factual. The family asked about the charges. I just want to make sure the documentation matches what actually happened. The silence stretched for 2 seconds. Then footsteps, fast. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway like a storm front, his face rigid with the kind of controlled fury that only emerges when someone has exposed a miscalculation. His eyes locked on Katie, and his voice emerged low and sharp, pitched deliberately for the entire hallway to hear. Are you questioning my documentation, Rodriguez? The way he said her name made it sound like an accusation. Mrs. Chen's grip on her husband's hand tightened. Mr. Chen's face darkened. This is exactly why we have real doctors handle complex cases. Mercer stepped closer, his presence suddenly filling the small room like something pressurized. Nurses who think they know better than physicians create dangerous situations. You're confusing a grieving family with your incompetence. Maybe if you spent less time playing detective and more time learning basic nursing skills, we wouldn't have these problems. Katie stood motionless. Her hands hung at her sides, perfectly still. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The trembling in her chest wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind that comes from years of absorbing hits and never flinching back. She watched Mercer turn to the family with a practiced expression of sympathy, the kind of smile that looked genuine only if you didn't know what genuine looked like. "I apologize for the confusion. Sometimes our less experienced staff don't understand the complexities of emergency billing." Mr. Chen nodded slowly, doubt spreading across his face like spilled ink. Mrs. Chen wouldn't meet Katie's eyes anymore. The break room at 11:33 a.m. was a study in coordinated abandonment. Katie pushed through the door, already tired, her scrubs damp from a spill in the supply closet that no one had bothered to tell her about. She reached for the cracked navy mug on the shelf, the one with the faded anchor that she'd bought at a small shop in Norfolk 8 years ago, and filled it with coffee that had been brewing since 6 in the morning. The smell of it was acrid, burnt, the kind of coffee that tasted like regret and overtime. She sat at the table by the window. Nurse Williams, who'd been checking her phone on the far side of the room, suddenly stood. "Oh, I need to check on Mrs. Patterson in 406. Her vitals looked concerning." She left without making eye contact. Tech Davis, who'd been sorting lab results at the counter, shuffled his papers into a folder with exaggerated urgency. "Forgot about these specimens. Need to get them to the lab before the cutoff." He was gone within 30 seconds. By the time Katie set her mug down, the room was empty except for the fluorescent lights and the ghost of every conversation that had stopped mid-sentence when she'd entered. The isolation settled on her shoulders like a familiar weight. She'd worn it before, in different uniforms, in different countries, in rooms where the people who'd worked beside her suddenly found urgent tasks elsewhere when she approached. The muscle memory was ancient. She sipped the terrible coffee and stared out the window at the Colorado Springs afternoon, where the mountains cut clean lines against a sky that didn't care about hospital politics or billing discrepancies or the sudden cruelty of people who'd shared lunch tables with you yesterday. By end of shift, the disciplinary board outside the nurse manager's office displayed a new posting. The letters were printed in that official sans serif font that hospitals used for serious things: Rodriguez, K. Documentation failures, final warning, administrative review pending. 3 nurses read it in the span of 8 minutes. All 3 glanced at Katie, then quickly away, the way people look at accident scenes and keep driving. The next morning arrived the way all bad mornings do, with coffee that tasted like resignation and assignments that felt like punishment. Mercer waited until rounds to deliver his next move. "Rodriguez, you'll be handling post-surgical patient care this shift. Starting with the bedpan rounds." He said it casually, as if it were routine, but everyone in the station understood. Bedpan duty was for nursing assistants, 19-year-olds earning minimum wage and community college credits, not nurses with 5 years of experience. Not people who'd been doing this job longer than most of the residents had been in medical school. She accepted the assignment with a nod and moved through the patient's 43 minutes of tasks designed to diminish, to remind her of where she sat in the hierarchy, to make sure she understood that there were consequences for asking questions about discrepancies that Mercer couldn't explain. The real tirade came at 14:32, when Mercer found her finishing charting in the station. His voice carried across the ward in that casual tone that somehow made everything worse. "Some people just aren't cut out for emergency medicine. Better to find out now before she really hurt someone." He was addressing Dr. Shah, but he was performing for the entire unit. Katie heard it. Everyone heard it. The venom in his voice was like something poured carefully, measured to cause maximum damage without crossing into anything that could be reported. He was competent at this, at least. He knew exactly where the line was. She listened to the entire tirade without moving. Her expression remained blank, her breathing steady, her hands perfectly composed on the desk. This was the part that training didn't teach you, the moment when you had to sit still while someone tried to dismantle you in front of witnesses, the moment when every instinct screamed to respond with something sharp and final. But that wasn't how this worked. Not yet. Not here. When Mercer finally paused for breath, Katie turned to face him. The shift in her posture was subtle, a spine straightening, a gaze that suddenly felt like it was measuring distances and calculating trajectories. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It was quiet, but the quiet of something dangerous at rest. "You talk like someone who's never had to account for a single life." She let the words hang in the air between them. Mercer's face darkened, but she was already turning away, moving toward the patient wing with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested the conversation was over whether he'd agreed to that or not. The station went silent. Even the monitors seemed to quiet, as if the machines themselves understood that something had shifted. That evening, as Katie pulled a patient's chart for the overnight shift, Mercer stopped her in the hallway outside the ICU. His voice was controlled now, but edged with something that might have been uncertainty. "The Admiral in 412 needs continuous monitoring through the night. Vital signs every 15 minutes. Try not to miss anything this time." The way he said it, the careful precision, the calculated insult, told her that his next move was being planned, that this wasn't over, that he was the kind of man who couldn't let a single act of composure go unanswered. She took the chart without responding. The patient information displayed across the top: Admiral James Harrison, Navy, post-operative cardiac, stable, recovering from a triple bypass. Katie's entire body went still for exactly 2 seconds. She knew that name. She knew it the way you know the names of people who've shaped your life without knowing they were doing it: the man who'd pulled her son David through officer candidate school, who'd written the recommendation letter that got him assigned to the Naval Academy, who held his career in hands that could open or close doors David hadn't even known existed. Her son had mentioned him in letters, in phone calls, in that careful way military families learn to talk about hierarchy and obligation and the people who held power over your futures. Admiral James Harrison. 304 days ago. Colorado Springs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Katie had already volunteered for the overnight shift. Mercer had waved his approval with a dismissive hand. Even she couldn't screw up taking vitals. The night stretched ahead of her now, 14 hours of monitoring a man who existed at the intersection of everything she'd buried and everything she was pretending to be, and somewhere in those hours, something was going to break. The monitor flatlined at 2:27 a.m. Not gradually. Not with warning. A straight horizontal line on the screen where Admiral James Harrison's heartbeat had been ticking steadily just 3 seconds before. The ICU fell into that peculiar silence that only happens when a body stops performing the minimum function required to stay alive. Katie was checking vitals. She'd been checking the same vitals every 2 hours for 18 days, moving through the Admiral's post-operative care with the invisible efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that competence goes unnoticed, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Oxygen saturation holding at 96. Blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate steady at 62. Everything a cardiac surgeon dreamed of seeing at this stage of recovery. Then everything changed. The alarm wasn't loud. That was what people always got wrong about hospitals. The codes weren't announced with thunder. They came as a soft electronic wail, almost apologetic, almost polite. Katie's hand was already moving to the call button as she read the rhythm on the screen: no P waves, no QRS complex, just that devastating flat line that meant the graft had failed, that the surgical repair holding the Admiral's heart together had come undone, that in approximately 4 minutes without oxygen, his brain would start dying. She pressed the code button. The response was immediate. You learned that at Cedar Creek, that at least they had the infrastructure down, but infrastructure wasn't the same as skill. Resident Chen arrived first, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still learning the choreography of crisis. Resident Davis followed, tablet already in hand, ready to document. Neither of them moved toward the crash cart. Neither of them took charge. They stood at the foot of the Admiral's bed like they were waiting for permission. "Where's surgery?" Katie's voice was level. Not panicked. Not desperate. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Resident Chen swallowed. "Dr. Harrison is in the OR. He's got 30 minutes on an abdominal repair. The on-call is 20 minutes out." Davis finished, checking his phone. At 8:07. The Admiral had been without effective circulation for 40 seconds. In another 4 minutes, irreversible damage would begin. Katie could feel the calculation happening in her chest, not fear, that would come later if it came at all, just the cold mathematical reality of oxygen deficit and time. She moved past both residents without explanation, her hand closing around the scalpel from the crash cart. The blade was sterile. The angle was correct. The location between the 4th and 5th ribs had been muscle memory for 11 years, burned so deep into her nervous system that her body knew the path even when her mind was walking a very careful line between her buried self and the nurse she was pretending to be. "Get me a rib spreader and call for blood," Katie said, and something in her voice made both residents straighten. It wasn't a request. It wasn't phrased as a question. It was the kind of command that comes from someone who has given orders while explosions were happening around her, who has expected to be obeyed because lives depended on obedience. Resident Chen stammered, "You can't, we have to wait for." Katie was already cutting. The scalpel moved through the Admiral's gown, through the skin, with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, in sandstorms, in a vehicle that was being shot at. She poured betadine across his chest, the sharp smell of antiseptic rising like a prayer, like muscle memory taking over the way it always did when the moment demanded it. "If we wait, he's dead." Her hands were moving now, steady as surgical steel, steady as a woman who'd stopped being invisible the moment the flat line appeared on the screen. "I need a second set of hands. Now." The scalpel cut clean between the ribs. Her fingers spread the incision, reaching inside his chest cavity, feeling for the heart the way someone might reach for a rope in the dark, by touch, by faith, by the kind of training that doesn't forget even when you spend years pretending it never happened. The Admiral's thoracic cavity was filling with blood from the failed anastomosis, from the graft that had torn open, from the catastrophic failure of surgical repair. Resident Davis, to his credit, stopped thinking and started moving. His hands took the retractors that Katie thrust toward him, holding the incision open while she worked. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, but he didn't freeze. He didn't run. He held the space for her to work. "There's a clot blocking the graft. I can feel it." Katie's voice remained flat, clinical, the voice of someone reporting data, not someone elbow deep in a dying man's chest. "Suction. Now." The sound of the suction catheter hissing was familiar. The resistance as it pulled blood and clot from the operative field. The way the anatomy became visible once you removed the obstruction. Her fingers found the heart, found the graft, found the exact point where the vascular repair had failed. She began manual compression, massaging the Admiral's heart with the kind of precision that only comes from having practiced it on human bodies in conditions where there was no backup plan, no second chance. 2 minutes passed. The monitor stayed flatline. 3 minutes. Still nothing. Her fingers worked the heart, her other hand using a clamp to compress the descending aorta, to redirect what little circulation existed toward the brain, toward keeping the Admiral's mind alive even as his body was failing. This was the part they didn't teach in textbooks, the part that existed in the space between protocol and survival, the part that required you to understand that sometimes rules existed because they weren't equipped to handle someone like you. "Come on," she whispered, and it was the first sound of emotion in her voice, not desperation but something closer to dialogue with the body under her hands. "Not today. Not this one." The monitor showed a single beat. Then another. Sinus rhythm flickered back to life, hesitant, then steady. The Admiral's oxygen saturation began climbing, 65, 72, 78, climbing toward the numbers that meant survival, that meant his brain wasn't drowning, that meant Katie's hands had been fast enough, had been good enough, had been exactly what they needed to be. She continued the compression for another 30 seconds, then released. The heart was beating on its own now, small but present, the kind of heartbeat that meant a second chance. The surgical team arrived at 2:59 a.m., 60 seconds before the on-call surgeon would have walked through those doors. They took in the scene in a single horrified moment, Katie Rodriguez, the quiet nurse from the night shift, covered in blood, standing over an open chest cavity with her hand still inside it. Resident Davis holding retractors with shaking hands. The Admiral's vital signs stabilizing on the monitors. Dr. Mercer arrived 30 seconds later. Katie saw his face change as he took in the scene. Saw the moment his eyes traced the incision, the rib spreader, the evidence of a field thoracotomy performed without authorization, without attending supervision, without any of the legal structure that was supposed to protect liability and hierarchy and the careful chain of command that kept hospitals running. Katie stripped off her gloves with the careful deliberation of someone who had all the time in the world, who knew exactly what was about to happen and had already decided how she would meet it. The blood on her hands had belonged to a dying man moments ago. Now it belonged to her, to the consequences, to the reckoning, to the part of her that had always known this moment would come. What the hell happened here? Mercer's voice was tight, controlled, dangerous in the way that voices got when someone had just been handed exactly what they needed. Katie met his eyes. Her voice was flat, the voice of someone reporting facts, not excuses. He was dying. I saved him. Mercer's smile was cold. It was the smile of a man who'd just been given the instrument he needed, who'd been waiting for the moment when her composure, her competence, her refusal to accept the limitations of her position would finally overreach. His words came out slowly, each one a deliberate strike. You performed an authorized surgery without physician supervision. You're not a surgeon. You're a nurse who just ended her career. The surgical team moved in around the Admiral, their hands taking over the thoracotomy, preparing for proper closure, for the legitimate hierarchy of skills and credentials and institutional authority. Katie stepped back. She removed her gown. She began walking toward the door, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever came next would end everything she'd built in Colorado Springs, would expose the careful fiction of her identity, would bring everything she'd been hiding crashing down. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that standing in the Admiral's ICU, covered in blood she'd shed to save a man's life, Katie Rodriguez felt something shift inside her. The careful posture of invisibility had cracked. The quiet nurse act was finished. And whatever happened next, whoever came looking, whoever wanted answers, she was done hiding. Dr. Mercer didn't hesitate. The moment the OR doors swung shut behind Katie, he was moving, not running, something worse than that. Purposeful. Strategic. He knew exactly who to call and in what order, the way a chess player knows which pieces to sacrifice. His first call came at 11:53 a.m., interrupting the hospital board president midswing at the country club. Margaret Ashford had been Cedar Creek Medical's board president for 8 years, and she'd learned long ago that Mercer's calls meant problems that required immediate damage control. Margaret, we have a massive liability situation. His voice was steady, controlled. A nurse performed an authorized surgery. Field thoracotomy. No attending present. No surgical consent from the patient. I have 3 residents who witnessed the entire breach. Margaret's golf club lowered. Which nurse? Katie Rodriguez. The one I flagged for documentation failures last week. She's been unstable, Margaret. This was a catastrophic lapse in judgment masked as heroism, but the hospital is exposed. If anything goes wrong with that patient, if there are complications, we're liable for every cent. Margaret was already walking toward her car. I'll call legal. Don't let her near another patient. The second call was harder to trace but infinitely more effective. Mercer had kept the number from Katie's previous hospital, St. Catherine's in Denver. He needed her employment history to have gaps, inconsistencies, something that would unravel when examined too closely. The director of nursing at St. Catherine's answered on the second ring, and Mercer's voice took on a different quality, almost apologetic, almost concerned. I'm calling about a former employee, Katie Rodriguez. She listed St. Catherine's as a reference, and I'm conducting a standard background verification for our credentialing process. Pause. I'm finding some discrepancies in her timeline. She claims to have worked as an RN from 2019 to 2022. Yes, that's correct. The director's voice was uncertain, which was exactly what Mercer needed. I'm just trying to verify her certifications match what she's listed with us. Do you have copies of her original credentials on file? There was a hesitation. They should be in HR. I can have someone pull them. That would be helpful. And if you don't mind me asking, did she ever have any performance issues? Anything unusual about her tenure? Another pause, longer this time. No, she was excellent. Very quiet, kept to herself, but her charting was meticulous. Why? Mercer smiled into the phone. Just routine verification. Thank you. He hung up before they could ask more questions. The third move was the one that would finish it. At 1:15 p.m., Mercer brought in Dr. Martin Hayes, an external medical practice investigator who specialized in credential verification and background audits. Hayes was the kind of consultant who asked questions first and made judgments later, a man who believed that inconsistencies in a file usually meant something deliberate was being hidden. I want every certification checked against national databases, Mercer said, handing Hayes a folder with Katie's employment application. Her RN license, her BLS certification, her advanced life support credentials. Something about her doesn't add up, and I need to know what before this gets worse. Hayes looked at the file, then at Mercer. You think she falsified her credentials? I think she's hiding something. And I think an authorized surgery by someone with questionable background checks is the kind of thing the state medical board needs to know about. Hayes nodded and left with the folder. By 2:33 p.m., he'd already found the first inconsistency. Katie's RN license showed a renewal in 2021, but her employment at St. Catherine's supposedly covered 2019 to 2022. The timeline didn't match perfectly. There were other gaps, other small impossibilities that made sense only if you didn't look too carefully, if you accepted the story as told. But Hayes was paid to look carefully, and every thread he pulled made the whole thing unravel a little more. By 6:02 a.m. the next morning, Katie was summoned to the administrator's office. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw the security guard standing in the hallway outside the glass-walled room. Inside, hospital administrator Michael Wallace sat behind his desk, his expression carefully neutral. Dr. Mercer stood to his right, and beside him was Dr. Martin Hayes with a thick folder open in front of him. Ms. Rodriguez, please sit. Wallace's voice had that funeral home quality, the tone people used when they'd already made a decision and were just performing the formality of telling you about it. Katie Saturday. She didn't remove her jacket. Her hands remained visible, resting on her lap, the habit from another life, in another desert, where sudden movements got people killed. We've completed a preliminary review of your actions yesterday, Wallace continued, and a background verification of your employment history. There are significant discrepancies. Dr. Hayes opened the folder. Your RN license renewal in 2021 doesn't align with your employment dates at St. Catherine's. The Denver hospital has no record of your orientation documentation. Your BLS certification has a gap between 2020 and 2022 that's not explained in your file. Katie didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Additionally, Mercer added, his voice smooth as oil, your actions yesterday constituted practicing beyond your scope of license. You performed a surgical procedure without authorization, without supervision, without the attending surgeon's consent. That's not heroism, Ms. Rodriguez. That's recklessness. That's a liability we can't have in this hospital. Wallace leaned forward slightly. Effective immediately, your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated. Your credentials are stripped pending investigation. You'll need to cooperate with the state medical board regarding the authenticity of your certifications. The security guard stepped forward. One held a cardboard box. It took 30 seconds for Katie to collect her things from her locker. The cracked navy mug, a gift from Martinez's mother, stamped with the date of his death. The small dying succulent she'd kept alive on the break room windowsill for 3 years, a thing that should have died but hadn't. And there, in a clear plastic bag, the folded flag from the memorial service for Marcus Martinez, the flag that no official ceremony would ever present because Marcus's death, like her service, like everything that mattered, had been erased. The security guards walked her to the exit. Nurses watched from their stations, their eyes carefully averted. Nobody waved goodbye. Nobody texted later. By the time Katie reached the parking lot, she was already a ghost. That evening, the rain came to Colorado Springs the way it always did in late spring, sudden and without mercy. Katie stood at the bus stop on North Academy Boulevard, cardboard box balanced on her hip, her civilian clothes soaked through. Water dripped from her hair. Her hands were cold, the kind of cold that came from standing still too long, from waiting for something that wasn't coming. She looked at the flag through the plastic. Martinez's name embroidered in gold thread. 18 years old when he died. 23 when they brought him out in a body bag. The citation she'd never seen, the medal she'd never received, the death certificate that didn't exist in any file that mattered. A bus came and passed without stopping. Then another. The rain intensified, and Katie didn't move. The bus stop shelter had broken glass and graffiti, but she didn't move into it. She stood in the open, letting the rain soak her, letting it fill the space where 17 combat saves used to live, where 3 tours used to matter, where a Navy Cross used to mean something before they told her she didn't exist. Her phone buzzed. An automated message from Cedar Creek Medical's HR department: "Your final paycheck is available through direct deposit." She looked at the cracked mug. It had come from a hospital gift shop in San Diego, something Martinez had bought as a joke 5 days before his deployment. The handle had broken on a forward operating base in Ramadi, and she'd glued it back together with field expedient epoxy and hope. It should have shattered completely by now. But it held. The sound of the rain intensified, hammering the metal roof of the bus shelter like distant fire. Katie closed her eyes. Muscle memory didn't fade just because the world told you that you did. She was still standing there when a black SUV pulled up to the curb, headlights cutting through the darkness. The window rolled down. A man in dress uniform leaned out, Navy insignia catching the streetlight. "Ms. Rodriguez." His voice was careful, respectful in a way that suggested he knew exactly who she was. "I've been looking for you. 3 years." That's how long Admiral James Harrison had been searching. Not through official channels, those had dried up the moment Katie Rodriguez's records were sealed under national security protocols, but through the kind of quiet, relentless investigation that only a man with his clearance could conduct. He traced ghost employment records backward through 3 states, found the fabricated reference letters, located the hospital that had erased her credentials, and finally arrived at Cedar Creek Medical on a Tuesday morning in March with his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass and his jaw set in the same expression he wore before operations. The supply closet on the 3rd floor of the cardiac unit wasn't where he expected to find her. Katie was restocking 14-gauge angiocath needles into the wall-mounted cabinet, her movements precise and economical, when the Admiral stopped in the doorway. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he didn't move. Didn't breathe. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to the moment unfolding beneath them. Her hair was longer now, grayer at the temples, pulled back in the same practical braid she'd worn in the desert. Same scar on her left forearm, visible where her sleeve rode up. Same hands, steady hands, hands that could save a life or end one with equal precision. He whispered her call sign like a prayer. "Reaper." Katie's hand stilled. She turned slowly, and when she saw his face, saw the recognition, the certainty, the 3 years of searching finally resolved, something shifted behind her eyes. Not shock. Never shock. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a debt being called in. "Admiral. Come with me." It wasn't a request. The hospital administrator, Wallace, was waiting in the conference room on the administrative floor, flanked by legal counsel and wearing the expression of a man who had no idea what was about to unfold. The external investigator, the same one Mercer had hired 3 years ago to destroy Katie's credentials, was there too, standing beside a cardboard box filled with billing records. The Admiral entered first, Katie following 2 steps behind, and the air pressure in the room changed. These men could taste it. Something fundamental had shifted. Wallace cleared his throat. "Admiral Harrison, I'm not sure I understand why." The Admiral's phone was already in his hand. He read from the screen without inflection, each word landing like a hammer strike. "Captain Katie Rodriguez. Navy Cross recipient. 17 combat saves documented. Operation Phantom Fury, Ramadi, 2008. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Medals of Valor, Unit Citation, Meritorious Service. He paused. Your records were sealed under presidential authority, Captain. Not lost. Not erased. Sealed. A Pentagon liaison's voice crackled over the speakerphone that someone, Wallace's attorney, probably, had already activated. Confirming all documentation. Ms. Rodriguez's military service is verified and classified. Her credentials as a registered nurse, her medical training, her field medicine certifications, all legitimate. All exemplary. The silence in the conference room was the kind that comes before avalanches. Katie stood with her hands at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression composed. She'd known this was coming. Maybe not the exact moment, but she'd known. The Admiral had been searching. And men like the Admiral always found what they were looking for. Dr. Mercer burst through the doors 17 seconds later, his face flushed, his voice already rising. This is absurd. This woman violated hospital protocol. She performed an authorized surgery. The credentials investigation was comprehensive, Anne. The credentials investigation. The external investigator stepped forward, opening the box. Which is what I need to discuss, Doctor. During my audit of Ms. Rodriguez's employment history and certifications, I was asked to expand my scope. The hospital's legal team requested a deeper examination of our billing practices. Mercer's face went the color of old concrete. What we found was significant. The investigator pulled out a ledger, each page marked with red flags. Phantom equipment orders. Inflated procedure codes. Supply charges for items that were never used, never received, but consistently billed to insurance carriers. All authorized by you. Over a 4-year period. The total comes to approximately $847,000 in fraudulent charges. Federal agents from the Healthcare Fraud Division appeared in the doorway like they'd been standing there the whole time, waiting for their cue. One of them, a woman with a voice like a tank idling in a garage, spoke without inflection. Dr. Marcus Mercer, we need you to come with us. We have a warrant to confiscate all records related to your billing practices and your relationship with Midwest Medical Supply. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I want my attorney. Already contacted, the federal agent said. They're meeting us downtown. As they led him out, Mercer's eyes found Katie's. For just a moment, she thought she saw something flicker across his face, not fear exactly, but the horrible clarity that comes when you realize the trap was always closing around you, and you never saw it coming. The weapon he'd forged to destroy her had turned in his hand. The external investigator he'd weaponized 3 years ago had found something far more damaging than a nurse practicing beyond her scope. They'd found him. The hospital administrator, Wallace, was already on his phone, distancing himself. By noon, the hospital had issued a statement. By end of shift, the nursing board that once displayed Katie's disciplinary warning had been replaced with a new memo. Cedar Creek Medical is honored to welcome back Captain Katie Rodriguez, whose service and sacrifice exemplify the highest standards of medical care. The break room fell silent when it was posted. The nurses who'd once fled when she sat down now gathered around it, reading her name, their faces carrying the weight of 3 years of misjudgment. 6 months later, Katie stands in her office, a real office, not a storage room, with her name printed on the door in professional lettering, Katie Rodriguez, RN, Director of Emergency Medical Training. Through the window that overlooks the parking lot, she watches a medical supply van pull up to the loading dock. The driver climbs out wearing a company polo shirt, khaki pants, the uniform of someone driving equipment deliveries instead of performing surgery. Dr. Mercer is no longer licensed. No longer welcome in any hospital in Colorado. The company that once paid him kickbacks is now his only employer, and even they keep him in the field, away from decision-makers, away from people who might remember who he used to be. He loads boxes into the van with the careful movements of someone whose hands have lost their authority. Katie watches without satisfaction, without anger, just the quiet recognition that some men build their own cages and then spend years wondering why they can't escape. The knock on her door is Admiral Harrison, and beside him stands her son David, both in dress uniforms, both carrying the bearing of men who have seen real things. The Admiral is holding a shadow box. Inside it, arranged with military precision, is her Navy Cross, her Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a photograph of her team in Ramadi, young faces, serious eyes, including the face of Martinez, the man who didn't make it home, whose dog tag she'd carried in her pocket for 3 years. These should never have been hidden, Captain, the Admiral says. His voice carries the weight of command, but something deeper too, gratitude, maybe, or the recognition of a debt that can never fully be repaid. Your service. Your sacrifice. Your team's sacrifice. The world needs to see what you gave. David steps forward and embraces his mother, then steps back, his eyes moving from her face to the shadow box to the folded flag that sits on her desk beside the photograph. Mom, the Admiral told me everything. About Ramadi. About what you did for him. About why you disappeared. I always wondered why you never talked about your service. Katie looks at her son's face, a man now, in dress uniform, understanding for the first time why his mother had carried silence like a weapon for so long. She picks up the folded flag, runs her fingers across the fabric, across the name embroidered on the corner, Martinez. Some wounds need time to heal. Some secrets need time to be told. Some people need to be ready to listen before you can tell them the truth. She hangs the shadow box on the wall behind her desk, positioning it so that every nursing student who walks into this office for training will see it. Will see the medals. Will see Martinez's young face. Will understand that heroism doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it works the night shift. Sometimes it pushes a mop. Sometimes it shows up in a supply closet with a steady hand and an unbreakable commitment to saving lives, no matter the cost. The Admiral salutes her, a formal gesture, a recognition of rank, a thank you that words could never carry. Katie returns the salute, and then something shifts in her face. The mask drops just enough to show him the woman beneath it. She smiles. Call me Katie. And thank you for not giving up the search. As they leave, she sits at her desk and picks up the cracked Navy mug, the one she's kept for 3 years, the one that nearly got her fired. She speaks to the photograph of Martinez, to the memory of Ramadi, to the ghost of every life she saved that the Pentagon ordered erased. We made it, hermano. We finally made it home. Below her office window, Dr. Mercer drives a van full of medical supplies out of the Cedar Creek parking lot. He doesn't look up. Katie doesn't look away until the van disappears around the corner, dissolving into traffic like a scar fading with time. Her phone buzzes. A text from David, proud of you, Mom. Always have been. She types back, I know. Now everyone else will too. Through the walls of her office, she can hear the hospital moving, the elevator doors opening and closing, the code blue alerts, the organized chaos of people trying to save lives. She picks up her badge, reads the name printed there, Captain Katie Rodriguez. The title that was stolen. The title that was earned. The title that finally, after 3 years of searching, belongs to her again. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of, subscribe and like this video. Tell me in the comments, would you have let him face justice, or would you have walked away when you had the chance? And if you want to see more stories about the quiet heroes nobody sees coming, hit that notification bell. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.